The efforts against the American working class began long before Reagan swore into the White House. I've covered much of the propaganda and gaslighting tactics America's rich and powerful establishment elite have used to keep us from our money, to prevent us from the pursuit of prosperity, to hinder our happiness, crushing any opposition voices and then hurting whatever wasn't stomped into silence into a right or left pen of opinion, to dissolving our unions, promoting propaganda, reducing regulations, and putting a price tag on each and every single thing in this world, including people. I've established that American capitalism is an abject failure and a pyramid scheme that if America were a business, America Corp would be under investigation by America for their corrupt business dealings. America's government, for the most part, aside from waste and corruption, works as it was intended about 250 years ago. But our economy is broken and we're out of glue. And all the king's horses and all the king's men can't put us back together again. We've invested in big business for over 100 years. What has corporate America done to invest in us besides creating the material things we all just can't live without? American capitalism simply doesn't work without slavery. Greed is addictive. It's insatiable. There's never enough. And in the profit chain, the most expendable link is the workers. For those in power, it soon becomes that, how dare these people ask for wages? We're giving them purpose. Greed begets greed, 7 deadly sins and whatnot. All spiritualities warn against greed. In fact, most advocate for the polar opposite, abnegation of all worldly and material things. Big word. Sorry. Giving up things you like, not letting things overcome the soul. Yet American Christianity is wrapped in dollar bills lined in gold. And you can be too if you watch my show, buy my books, and forget blinky televangelists or multimillionaires with plenty of influence to peddle. All of that happened because of Republicans. Specifically Nixon, but Reagan rose the Republicans out of the abject shame of corruption and into relevance, dominance, and fostering the social division we see today. Reagan carried the torch, leveled up. This is the breakdown of American morals and ethics. It's not really a conspiracy. It's happening right before our eyes. In this episode, I'll break down the assault on the American working class since the mid-20th century and how it's been exploited to breed the division in the American people. I'm revealing how our patriotism was exploited for nationalism and how it's being manipulated for fascism. This episode is about America destroying itself. Now, when these next 2 episodes are done, that following episode, the finale of the Create Your Own Conspiracy series, is about the parallel path of those who aren't America, but are set out to destroy us. We were dumbed down and numbed down over decades deliberately. And just as this plan to make us dumb and numb played out, that parallel plan was setting the stage for the fall of America by those who have opposed our culture, our imperialism, our ways of life, our debauchery, our blasphemy, our arrogance, our bravado. While America is brother after brother, our enemies are roasting their marshmallows over the smoldering ashes of our unity. Bigotry no longer works. Fear no longer works. Patriotism no longer works. America is divided. We've done that to ourselves, but we let it happen. But there are others who had a stake in this division. That's coming up after this series. This one is about how America royally raw-dogged America. And welcome to the podcast. Previously on Overthinking Everything, Create Your Own Conspiracy. Richard Nixon back to Reagan and deregulation into Murdoch, McMahon, and Trump to explain the deliberate dumbing down and numbing down of society. Then came 1992 to 1996, the finalities of deregulation under Democrats and the open floodgates of mass media, mass marketing, and unregulated propaganda. Turn the page, 1997, Clinton scandal, America's heroes had fallen, Pee Wee Herman, O.J. Simpson, Mike Tyson, Hulk Hogan, the list goes on and on. Now, the president literally caught with his pants down, lying Democrats defend him, protect him. America's moral integrity gave way to ethical ambiguity. The greater the moral dilemma presented, the more we would compromise our morals. What we didn't want to admit is that psychologically humans are sort of narcissistic by nature. I argue that's a part of sapience, but here nor there. Entertainment, specifically since the 80s, has brainwashed us and influenced us, lowering our emotional and intellectual intelligence, lowering our standards on a subliminal level, one we think is harmless until we catch ourselves falling prey to the behavior we mimic from where exactly? Technology expanded that exponentially, and we, the people, weren't prepared for it. A chink in the armor, a crack in the glass. It was all they needed. The internet was in every home, soon to be in every pocket. Because there's a parallel agenda here. There are multiple entities playing different games, thinking they're playing their opponent, while their opponent has been aware of their every move, 3 moves in advance. America's two-party politics has been eating itself alive, dividing we, the people, from our representative voice in our government. In fact, we're all truly fighting the same battle. It is we, the people, against the corrupt, corporate-run government of the United States. However, because of the pens we're herded into, we're focused on one party or the other from election to election, convinced we fixed the problem by switching which letter in parentheses sits behind the resolute desk, without seeing that both sides are guilty. I've proven that already in this series, and mine is a nonpartisan perspective, a progressive yet pragmatic perspective. This series is detailing the playbook Reagan used, which was set up by the post-Eisenhower Nixonian Republicans to win at any cost, even if it meant flat-out lying to the American people. They would come to find that Americans didn't know before mass media told them and didn't care once mass media did tell them not to care. This series is about the social devolution at the hands of Murdoch, McMahon, and Trump that was possible because of Reagan, and whose successes were also built around that same playbook Reagan used. The thing about working from a playbook is that those playbooks are open to all players in the post-20th century interconnected world of mass communication. Just as we should have studied the events in our history and learned from them, those who aren't us have watched and learned from us, from our failures, from our mistakes, from our open and honest carelessness. America. You know, in our early days when we were unrepentantly whipping our workforce into shape, literally, people didn't hold us accountable. This new land was rich in resources, and the colonies had that newfound autonomy. Just like we do with China today, you play nice with terrorists and criminals against humanity when you want their cheap things. And just like with China's cheap things now, we Americans ignore the why behind it being so cheap. We just buy. Just like with China today, the world ignored our atrocities because they were awash in their own, and our stuff was nice and new and cheap, low overhead and all. So having never resolved our own narcissistic sociopathic past behavior, America looks at our victims and says, just trust me, I won't do it again. And then America lynched them for sitting on our couch. America barely thought they should be allowed to sit on their own couches, if we're being fair. Hell, who are we kidding? Many in America still don't believe people of color should even have a couch to begin with. And even if some think they could, most of those people only believe people of color can have a couch so long as it isn't nicer than ours. The couch is just, well, it could be anything. I wish it didn't always come down to white supremacy and classism, but that's the root of all this. That's the unresolved trauma of America. The issue we never resolved, though, America's original sin, was twofold. The lie we told ourselves and the lie we told the world. That in America, all men are created equal. And we sold that shit with a straight face. Maybe you remember one of my earlier episodes where I deconstructed my journey through faith and spirituality. I spoke about my revelation, pun intended, that sin isn't just about the victim you harm. It's about the harm you cause yourself in the process of the sin. the humanity you surrender to commit it. First off, I'm not really a believer in hell or sin and all that hullabaloo in context, but the idea that we bring about the negative energy we give off is something that is shared by pretty much all major spiritualities. Selfishness and manipulating others to get what you want are frowned upon almost everywhere, religiously or spiritually speaking. Almost everywhere. Personal biases aside, for the sake of cultural arguments, America is not a Christian nation by doctrine or governmental decree. In fact, the opposite is true in those respects. However, America is a Christian nation culturally, in that most of our norms and mores are developed from Judeo-Christian principles, and we allow that to happen. We could argue that America foundationally would identify as a Christian if he were a person. A non-practicing Christian, mind you, but bygones. This isn't the Founding Fathers. This is the influence of white Christo-fascist nationalism over generations, thanks to men like Ronald Reagan, men who place their nation over their God in their hearts, but outwardly project that they're pious and righteous patriot warriors defending their country in the name of God. Onward, Christian soldier and whatnot. That's scary. These people literally think our Constitution of the United States in the last 250 years or less of the entire span of all of existence was anointed and consecrated by God themselves. God, pro-America over everything else. Now deconstruct what kind of person believes that. Someone so narcissistic to believe that the almighty creator of the universe favors them above all else. Those people are at the center of their own fictional universe. In fact, they don't believe in God at all. If you listen carefully and read between the lines of modern American Christianity, or Christianity as a whole based on modern interpretations of the Bible, you'll find the deification of the self more than the humbling of the self to whatever higher power. Honor thy father and mother, the givers of life. I brought you into this world, I can take you out. Eternal life, the idea of magic and power and prayer and chance, it's all channeled through them. You can't seek oneness without going through one of them. Theirs is the only way. It's all very, very clinically diagnosable. We often leave that on the table, don't we? And that's difficult because it feels like a violation of their right to be mentally ill and not get called delusional, even though that is the very definition of delusions of grandeur, which is a big one on the checklist of, do I need mental health help? I sound dismissive and mean, especially of religion. But look, the need for religion is often ignored in the mental health field. Why do you feel a need to believe in a higher power? Address the fragility of accepting our mortality and our powerlessness in this universe. No, we're not ready for that. This is my point in the too much too soon argument of mental health versus everything. But the internet and social media specifically, on a society that wasn't prepared to have everything laid out before them on a buffet with no regard for health consequences, moderation, portion control, or sanitation. It's a bigger part of a bigger picture. If America's our parent, then we, the children, need to call Child Protective Services because we've been abused and neglected and exposed to way too much. Mental health should have come before any of it, especially religion. I'm not shaming or in any way denigrating mental health, and I don't mean to come off that way toward religion. It's that religion is such a sensitive value that manipulating that or tolerating that being manipulated is the slipperiest of societal slopes. Patriotism, religion, race, and class. These are the four tips of the swastika. Mental health plays into this because the science was there for a long time. Nazis attempted to destroy a lot of it. They knew if people understood, they would be way harder to manipulate. But mental health is a dangerous thing to toy with, especially on a mass scale. However, America did just that. If you can realign the principles of values of patriotism, your practical and physical security, safety, and pride, if you can influence the principles and values of religion, your spiritual and eternal security, safety, and pride, and if you can create a society where the people are convinced looking different matters and that money is the most valuable commodity, then you pretty much secured a base of fervent, passionate, and easily manipulatable supporters, ready to do your bidding at the first call to action. Earlier in the series, I told you about these two similar speeches Ronald Reagan gave during his big switch from Democrat to Republican. 5 years apart. He gave two very similar commencement speeches. Now, while the speeches were very nationalist in nature, citing God's promise and this sort of spiritually entitled language I just spoke about, that second speech at his church school alma mater was more influenced by his corporate brainwashing experiences, while as a paid anti-union, anti-government propagandist by General Electric. In that latter speech to the church school, God's promise was cloaked in commercialism, consumerism, and heralding corporate America as the Messiah. Well, now that was a telltale sign that problems were on the horizon if Reagan were allowed to grow in power. Why problematic? The minute religion is used as a manipulation tool to drive sales, that's taking the Lord's name in vain. Using religion to manipulate people to go against the teachings and do what you want, using religion to influence legislation. To quote renowned nuclear physicist and expert in parapsychology, Dr. Egon Spengler, don't cross the streams. That conflict of interest warps the purity of spiritual teachings, and it turns people away from spirituality more than drawing them into religion. In fact, the people that often draws in are corrupt of heart, mind, and soul, those opportunistic self-servers who are only there for religion, so that religion washes away and excuses their abhorrent behavior, benefits them or pays off for them, like business networking or someone so self-unaware emotionally that they need this fantastical make-believe thing to be true for them to have meaning and value in a world that doesn't always seem to have meaning and value, and to cope with their mortality. There's a comfort to thinking there's an afterlife, knowing that you're not watching the clock count down, tempted to just live every moment as your last. Carpe diem! No. If you do this one right, and you get to live forever, you be immortal, like a god. Be a good boy and work hard. Meanwhile, those who don't need some fairy tale to keep them morally and ethically in line find other paths outside organized religion. But allowing religion to color outside religion's lines has caused social friction, not only in America, but throughout the world in our history. Just like American capitalism can't succeed without slavery, religion cannot succeed without oppression and overreach of influence. Now, please note the difference here between religion and spirituality or faith. Let's discuss social friction for a moment. It's all relevant to Nixon, Reagan, and this conspiracy, since their respective rises to power fed off of tearing down that fourth wall of reality and exploiting, then dismantling the indivisible wall between church and state. That's what has bred the socially divisive atmosphere we see today. America's Me Too and Time's Up movements, Black Lives Matter, Stop Asian Hate, Defend Drag, so many more, are recent boilings over of decades and generations of frustrations by groups who have been largely ignored by a system built by white people on the basis of keeping things white. As society evolves, with more and more of those traditionalist conservative people dying off and more people who aren't in the marginalized group stepping up, not to be saviors, but to be the change we want to see in the world, that social friction increases so long as the marginalized group still has vocal oppressors. Those opposed to the progress will fight back loudly and violently, while those whom the progress affects most become vigilant and more vocal. Cue the Tom Petty. No one will back down. They will stand their ground. And who can blame them? There shouldn't have been any of these movements to begin with. They shouldn't have been necessary. If we, the people, sat by and watched while the church infiltrated the state, then if the church was really what it said, the church would have been fighting for the justice that would have made the Me Too and Time's Up movements, Black Lives Matter, Stop Asian Hate, Defend Drag, and so many more unnecessary. But this friction was played for profit, tossing us into a tumultuous tug of war over social issues we, the people, are powerless to ever fix, but those in power could have fixed long ago, but chose not to, for all the wrong reasons. Mostly because we fight over these things and it distracts us. Today, we see those woke white left fighting fascism on one side, begging for help from marginalized communities who have never really had their many broken promises followed through with. If they were, there was always a trade-off, a sellout. Then you have the right who basically says, yeah, we're all racists and white supremacists, but we don't hide it. The Democrats are your real enemy because they're talk and they don't do anything. You'll see the right's fist flying towards your face, but you'll never see the left's knife in your back. So if we're going to discuss socio-political boilings over that led to where we are today, then white supremacist nationalist fascist groups like the KKK get dishonorable mention, maybe even so far as the insurrection. Not to excuse terrorists and traitors, but let's consider that oppression is one thing by itself. Perceived oppression is something quite different. Privileged oppression, if you will. It's quite the conundrum, but if anybody could pull that off, it's America, right? While we can argue that classism in America is the ultimate dividing factor, the haves and the have-nots, those will-haves for generations versus those who will never have at all. This country was built on many principles, but profit and inherited wealth were among them. White supremacy was another. The land of opportunity. But for whom specifically? This is where the race and class of that four-pronged twisted cross comes into play. While there are many reasons someone might have found Donald Trump appealing as a presidential candidate, his appeal to the disenfranchised white middle American voter was baited with racism, classism, nationalism, along with a fear-mongering and pandering to the evangelicals. He didn't have to try hard to convince them to sell their souls. They'd been conditioned to for decades, to take the bait once somebody dangled it. All they needed was the right someone. It couldn't be a politician like Nixon. That would make all politicians look bad. They needed someone who wasn't like them to be the scapegoat. Someone so corrupt and dirty whose ethics were so corrupt that those who supported him might be able to shrug away responsibility with, oh, I fell for a con. What was I supposed to do? He was a TV star. Let's not forget, though, that Nixon's shenanigans didn't do much to sink Republicans long term. These are immorally corrupt people working from a twisted ideology of manipulated values. They were made that way. It's not an excuse. Look, I could serve you a shit pie on the back porch all day long and you'd eat it, so long as you could smell that fresh apple pie in the oven that I'm saving for the inside company. In other words, you'll believe anything I tell you, no matter how contradicting to your values, if I could just fool one of your other senses or values into believing that what I'm doing is harmless or ultimately justified. This perceived oppression, privileged oppression, is spread through propaganda and media manipulation, and church. For this, Rupert Murdoch, Vince McMahon, and Donald Trump followed a playbook of dehumanizing and desensitizing their audiences while demonizing a revolving door of patsies, boogeymen, enemies, and scapegoats. Show me 3 other men of the last 3 or 4 decades who have conducted their business and or personal lives through lies, misleading their base, and unethical practices more than these men. With the understanding that televangelism is its own separate episode coming up later. How did children growing up in my generation and the one before me come away from Star Trek and Star Wars and come to idolize the Romulans or the Empire? Simple. It's marketing. You just got to make Darth Vader cooler than Luke. And exploit people's base instincts. People don't like change. The friction of progress versus traditionalism, rubbing society raw, clashing like the tectonic plates of Pangea. Those 4 tips of that twisted cross, when manipulated, become volatile. In fact, just as with desegregation and civil rights in the 1960s, the fight to acknowledge people of color as human beings in the 1860s caused the friction that bred the division. It was as simple as some people saying, hey, these are human beings, even if they don't look like you, talk like you, or think like you, they're still human beings, not animals. And then some people saying, no, they're not. There would have been no conflict whatsoever if everyone could just agree slaves were human beings. Or if everyone agreed to just stop fighting over it and just let the white people keep slaves. These moral dilemmas that we've been handed as a people often have clear right and wrong answers. And in those cases, doing the right thing takes some sacrifice. The KKK formed out of that friction of freeing the slaves and white Southerners through a perspective that completely disconnects the human acknowledgement, feeling the same ruthless oppression of the federal government run by the same religious zealots, the same elites that their families had come here to escape. The KKK was allowed to form because those liberal-leaning people, those few people in the South where being an abolitionist was hardest, were exhausted and fatigued from the fight. They had lost so much, and the war was over. It should have been over. Many fled to friendlier states, leaving even fewer in the South to resist. Very few Northern abolitionists went south. Think of this like cancer. If you just cut out the big part, barely medicate after, that cancer's growing back. Hell, America didn't even cut the cancer out when they beat the traitorous Confederacy. So the most aggressive of that cancer was allowed to grow, spread, and malignantly infect every aspect of our society today. Then, in the early 20th century, as global fascism was taking hold in places like Japan, Germany, Italy, and Russia to keep its people in check, America turned to the social strategy of nationalism, a close cousin of fascism. Early 20th century America had actual fascists and Nazis prominent in our society, trying to gain political power and holding rallies. History won't talk much about that, but it's very much a fact. With the rise of fascism around the world, American fascism still wasn't put down like the rabid dog it is. Even after Germany fell, Nazis fled Europe and went everywhere, taking their ideas with them. Even if they didn't share those ideas publicly or openly, they raised their families with those ideals and sought out communities who shared those ideals. It wasn't just like they lost and went, oh snap, I guess Hitler was wrong. The Nazis never went away. They certainly didn't in America. They're still here. They always have been. We allowed that to happen when we didn't see one and dropped them where they stood. That's not advocating for violence, it's patriotism. It's our duty as Americans to show zero tolerance for Nazis and fascism. We can tie this all together like a train. The current Republican Party is the engine pulling the cars of white supremacy and the white supremacist organizations like the Proud Boys, local state active clubs, Patriot Front, Nazis, 3%ers, Don't Tread on Me's, and the cars of America's historical systematic establishment of white supremacy, the racist Dixiecrats, the Confederacy, and all the way back to the anti-federalists at the front and MAGA at the caboose. And all intermixed in these terrifying train cars is white evangelical anti-Christian nationalists. And this train carried a lot of Americans in one car or another for most of our history. Over time, most Americans got off that train, but the all aboard was a siren song for so many feeling the economic, social, and cultural perceived or privileged oppression. In other words, poor white people being gaslit and manipulated to be convinced all their worries are the fault of a boogeyman, a bad guy, or a group that isn't like them and isn't the party asking for their votes. It's a trademark tactic of fascism. Number 3 on Dr. Lawrence Britt's checklist, if you're keeping score. We will at the end of the next episode. Identification of scapegoats or enemies as a unifying cause is a strategy intended to divide a people, keeping them at each other's throats over issues they can never resolve, while the rich and powerful get more rich and more powerful. But the enemy must look different. It isn't enough that they are different. Understand this. The masses are easy to control and temper when it's racial, geographical, or something distinguishable. You might have some tension, maybe even some social disruption. However, when the enemy looks like us and we can't tell the good from the bad among us, chaos, maybe even civil war. And soon everyone realizes the true division in America is classism before anything else. Eat the rich. Clearly, I'm speaking to white people with this part. My culture isn't one of open-mindedness enough to see that we are the last group to have experienced or realized this. The problem with white supremacy, white superiority, and the fight against it in America is that it's not white versus black or brown or Americans versus you ain't from around here's. This isn't an attack on our good feelings, security, patriotic pride, safety. It's an attack on our guilt. Confronting white supremacy shines a big old spotlight right on our own personal failures in this. For my culture, the toxic white Southern culture I speak of in this show, the real meat of the struggle is pride and blind loyalty. It's white versus white, friend versus friend, family versus family, reality versus reality, and us versus ourselves. That's hard. It's easy to dehumanize someone who looks different. Dehumanizing someone who looks like you, you've already related to them before you can hate them. People who look like us are instantly humanized. The visual foremost is the sense that is immediately processed by the brain. It's not necessarily racist, more brain trickery, and heavily influenced on cultural conditioning that is racist. It's why kids of a given culture might commune together in learning institutions. They feel safe and comfortable together. They learn better together. If you see people of a certain group living in a neighborhood together, joining organizations with each other, it's because our society is one that fosters the fear of being alone if you're not white. And of course, our natural instinct for tribalism or clanism, with a C. Now, when white people do that, it's usually with a K or 3. Or at least the risk is there. Sorry, friends and family, but it is different. Maybe not because of us individually, but we're part of it whether we know it or not, whether we want to be or not. That's just an inconvenient truth for us. We let it happen and lived in peaceful oblivion of warm public toilet seatedness for way too long, while others had no place to shit. Here we are. All this time later, America still can't decide which lives matter and who should be allowed to vote. We're still fighting about the same things, decades and decades later. That's deliberate, and the way they need it to be. By the end of this, you'll begin to understand why. It sounds so utterly inane, insane, and juvenile. But this is the dumbing down and numbing down of America. Not smart enough to understand facts and too caught up in our emotions like pride, fear, hatred, jealousy, anger, traditionalism, or security to care. And just like everything else I've talked about in this entire show, it's all for profit. This back and forth, it's good for business. But it didn't have to be this way. We could have been on our way to infinity and beyond, space, the final frontier. We could have led the charge to unite this planet and build a society that benefited everyone. But our accounting departments fainted at the loss of profits. So we just went with the making money on everything thing. Let's take a backward stroll through how we reached this level of corruption and division in America. Toward the end of Reagan's first term, a young representative from Georgia, Newt Gingrich, was building prominence and prestige in the Republican Party. Newt Gingrich was a no-nonsense uber conservative whose political ambition was to end the Democrats through obstruction. Obstructionism isn't anything new to American politics, and could be blamed in part for the Great Depression, among other historical disasters. However, it's the dangerous game many have chosen to play for generations. Bullwarism, a practice that's been outlawed in labor negotiations, was made famous by Lemuel Boulware, head of labor at General Electric in the 1950s. Boulware felt workers were here to work and serve their boss. Unions kept that from being the case. Unions made it so that the worker was seen as having value and should be protected as a human being. Boulware enlisted Reagan's ego and star power to gaslight, indoctrinate, and influence 250,000 GE employees against the American government and against unions. Boulwaristic strategies, a take it or leave it, my way or the highway negotiating style, is unethical and doesn't come to the table in good faith. Nixon practiced it. Reagan perfected it. In Gingrich, Reagan had his well-trained Boulwarian bulldog in Congress. In 1983, Gingrich, whose rise to political relevance was curiously expedited, founded an organization called the Conservative Opportunity Society. This was a group of conservatives who would meet regularly and strategize on how to push their agendas. Some of that strategy was to manipulate the puppet President Reagan. By 1984's election, Reagan's promise to America in 1985's State of the Union address was built on the, quote, Opportunity Society. You might remember I mentioned Reagan voted against the late 80s Civil Rights Restoration Act due to the voting rights objections he held. Gingrich voted against it too, and he voted to uphold Reagan's veto. Kiss the boot and up the ladder you'll shoot. Gingrich would become House Minority Whip soon after, and on to Speaker of the House, where he would wreak havoc on democracy. Gingrich's legacy isn't a positive one. He embarrassed himself and America ruthlessly and hypocritically going after Democrats on every single whiff of corruption, but unable to avoid his own scandals or address the corruption of his own party. Regardless, Gingrich was the next piece in place for the Christo-fascist movement that would come. Far-right extremist ideals rooted in misinterpreted, centuries-old caveman scrawlings. Self-serving, manipulated translations of our nation's founding principles, twisted to suit an agenda that would, hold for effect, make America great again. Reagan's 1980 campaign slogan. While it's unappealing to argue that Republican conservatives have been fascists all along, it's certainly difficult to argue against that over the last 3/4 of a century at least. The big switch was about Reagan shifting right, like many Americans did over issues like civil rights, but the big switch is very much about white supremacists finally having a place to call home in the Republican Party and a faction of its libertarian wing. By the end of this, you'll discover that the big switch was also about the Republican Party, America's conservatives, deciding to follow fascism. The facts simply back up my point. You could blame me or look at the facts as they are. With Gingrich orchestrating the destruction of the Democrats, Reagan could proceed unopposed in setting policy for nationalism in America. What's hilarious out of all that is Lincoln and early founders of what is now the Republican Party would come back to life and go to war with the current GOP over this nationalism. But this isn't Hollywood, even though Reagan took us pretty damn close. He got there with Gingrich. Newt Gingrich, the architect of modern conservative obstructionism and out-in-the-open corruption. Newt Gingrich, whose own scandals would take him down, but not before he took down Bill Clinton, which set off a domino effect in government where the retribution whistleblowing began. All those dirty little secrets they kept because it would be career suicide to tell on anyone. That whole bipartisan boys club, locker room loyalty. Republicans just took down the president for a beeger. There were suddenly a lot of leaks around Washington, and the plumbers weren't answering, so it's time to call the press. And call the press they did. It isn't like this corruption and hypocrisy wasn't always there. But this was the 90s, and the media was deregulated. The internet was starting, and everyone was connected to a screen. Republican after Republican was exposed for sex acts, corruption, and more. Then Democrats. Our politics devolved to a circus sideshow of deflection and retribution rather than accountability or standards. It wasn't that they were corrupt. It was that they told on our guys, so we're telling on them now. And it was America seeing the corruption had been there all along and had been covered up all along. What that did for America was cement an already wibbly-wobbly moral and ethical fiber into a society of moral compromise majority. One where when faced with the greatest of atrocities or the most clearly defined right answer, we justify our problematic behavior or ideals rather than grow and find new ways, or sacrifice anything but our humanity. The 90s was it. The era of the end of America's ethical integrity. We the people couldn't weather the too much too soon storm. We submitted to this new world order's Chimera lock, falling glass-eyed and unconscious, unable to even tap out. America was like custard. You have to be careful adding the eggs into it. If you add them too soon, too late, too fast, you'll have a scrambled mess. With the deregulated media, news devolving into infotainment, and the internet available in everyone's homes, reality and TV shows permeating our perspectives, America became a scrambled mess. Reagan's policies weren't respective of mental health, and in fact, America's policies at large aren't respective of mental health science. The kind of respect for mental health science to appoint a media czar or ambassador, an agency specifically to study mental health effects of media, any and all media. Not an agency to censor or warrant whether that media should be available, but to monitor and compile its findings. We deserve to know. We're 50 years since that should have happened. It still hasn't. Yet every commercial, program, song, film, it all has some effect on our mental state. If it can make us think, feel, or act, sing the stupid jingle, then we must accept that there is a mental health ramification for something so powerful and influential, even those silly earworms. My argument isn't for paintings or books. Some art isn't subjective to what I'm talking about. However, the fourth wall of television and film, audio and visual media, what used to be very clear wall that used to separate the audience from the fantasy, has been compromised over and over and over. I believe that's rocked a few foundations. Nixon tearing apart the integrity of the highest office in the land, lowering America's standards for leadership, was the first chink in the armor. Reagan lowering America's standards for the powers guaranteed by our Constitution with the treason that got him to the White House, as well as his propaganda gaslighting of the American people, the American working class, against the American government and their unions. It was essential to this plan. This plan built on convincing the American people to vote against their best interests, to surrender their rights, prosperity, and trust to whom? Their boss? Their government? Corporations? When they demonized unions and those individuals fighting for workers' rights or protesting wars, labeling them socialists and communists or hippies, they no longer had to discuss the ideological differences in their opposition. Their opposition was the enemy before they even got to speak. Gingrich breaking the long-held Democratic majority in the House in the 90s, his relentless witch hunts against numerous Democrats, including Bill Clinton, annihilated the integrity of American politics, degrading it to where we are today, lowering the Democrats to Nixonian ethical levels, bringing the Democrats down to the Republicans' level because the Republicans knew all along they had no desire to rise above. In fact, for at least 50 years, Republicans have known they wouldn't rise above. They sold their soul for power. One of the most influential organizations you probably never heard of, bred out of their knowing conservatism in American society, was dying. They knew the challenges in winning, playing the political game. But the people, society would eventually and inevitably grow more and more and more progressive, more out of their control, more free thinking. Conservatives knew that while many Americans by personality are conservative by the sense that we aren't risk takers, few of us are the skydivers, bungee jumpers, the stock market players, what have you. Many ride motorcycles or similar risky behavior and justify that as an accepted social norm, and we never really address the self-harm, suicidal tendencies behind the rush of what if I die out here and leave my family behind for a recreational, leisurely afternoon fun-time joyride. We eat red meat after 40. But when it comes to those adrenaline risks, most of us are pretty vanilla. Knowing that, we can begin to manipulate the masses. When it comes to something like skydiving, something I used to enjoy, a conservative thinker will say, yeah, but the chute may not open, or some other fair warning. That's rational and necessary for effective decision-making, critical thinking. Without that, the free-willing, exploratory, liberal thinking goes, this looks fun, already falling out of the plane. You're even farther to the outside conservative. It goes, no one should skydive because it can't be 100% safe or we can't make money on it. So we're going to make movies where everybody who jumps falls to their deaths. And then we'll put out misleading false articles about defective parachutes to scare everyone out of wanting to skydive. You know, for their own good. The progressive thinker sees that while dangerous and risky, skydiving can be fun and should be allowed because of freedom, but we need to make it such that the conditions are safe, optimal, and that within the given risk, no one is taking additional unnecessary, otherwise preventable risks. That the jumper and all parties involved should be protected, even from themselves. Once we apply that to literally everything else, we'll see a little clearly why the American Legislative Exchange Council was formed in 1973. Let's backstep a little, though, before we get there, and then we'll sidestep. This all gets confusing like a drunken mambo. When Barry Goldwater lost the 1964 election to Lyndon Johnson, American conservatives were left reeling. They'd kind of sold their souls and surrendered their platform to Goldwater's extremism in that election, and it didn't pay off. As it turned out, Republicanism, the way it was intended, died the moment Dwight D. Eisenhower stepped down. Everything after that was America fiscally leaning more conservative, a direct response to the bloated overgrowth of the federal government seen in the years following the New Deal. But socially, times they were a-changin'. Roosevelt's unprecedented 4 elections and 3 served terms set the stage for most of what we know of America's infrastructure today. When the writing on the wall was clear that Roosevelt wouldn't survive to see much past his 4th inauguration, a decision was made to reel that progress and government expansion in, when the Democratic establishment ousted Henry A. Wallace in favor of Harry Truman to be FDR's heir apparent. Republicans hadn't had the White House for 12 years. 12 years where America got fixed. Republicans caused the Great Depression. Democrats not only saved us from economic failure, but Democrats were going to stop Hitler. By 1944, no one in their right mind was going to change directions, especially with World War II all but won. Even if the president was all but dead in his wheelchair, with all due respect. This was an election where America would elect the vice president as the next president of the United States. Roosevelt's health decline was becoming obvious. Truman was a conservative Democrat, and both parties compromised that they would be able to work together better with someone who wasn't a full-blown progressive. Someone who wouldn't expand the New Deal like Wallace would, FDR's current vice president. The election prior, Henry Wallace had replaced John Nance Garner, the Texas white supremacist they called Cactus Jack. He was on the ticket to balance out Roosevelt's federal expansion and progressivism, to keep FDR in check. He didn't. It was tumultuous, to say the least. And it's important to note that Franklin Roosevelt was a known racist, too. You go back farther, and you'll find out Woodrow Wilson. But much of America was racist on some level back then. It was the norm for most of the 20th century. After being saddled with Garner again in 1936, FDR fought to make it so presidents could pick their running mates. In 1940, Nance had enough, so did Frank, and so Roosevelt decided the Secretary of Agriculture, Wallace, was the ideal choice. He was a stark contrast to Garner in every way. Henry Wallace was not a polished Washington insider, but that worked for FDR's advantage, pushing through more of his vision. In fact, Wallace was an enthusiastic New Dealer and humanist, and an anti-racist, anti-fascist, anti-Nazi, anti-corruption, pro-working class, non-Christian. Of course they called him a socialist and communist. I've covered different perspectives on this moment in history before. However, this pivotal moment was the beginning of the subjugation of the American working class, and it's worth refreshing for this episode. Both parties conspired to ensure the rightful successor to the New Deal legacy wouldn't take office. Now, Roosevelt was in on it too, but this was a movement at the 44 convention that put pressure on the Democratic powers that be to convince Roosevelt to turn on Wallace, mostly because of Henry Wallace's views, ideals, beliefs, and social philosophies, those that the American people resoundingly responded to. FDR made the call. Wallace was an unexpected thorn in the side of Roosevelt, clamoring for more responsibilities than the vice president position had up to that point. But Wallace's view was a more expanded form of democratic socialism, like we discussed today. A New Deal. A newer deal. His was a revolutionary vision, one most in Washington weren't willing to take a pay cut for. A large part of it, however, was the fact that Wallace would ascend to the presidency, having never run in an election in his life. Henry A. Wallace never won a race. He never paid his dues. He never joined the boys' club. He was never properly hazed. Yet here he is, Mr. Hometown Hokey America, Mr. Nice Guy, about to be elected vice president just as the leader of the free world is drawing his last breath. And the people loved him. He wasn't a great eloquent speaker. He wasn't the man you'd get to give that rousing halftime speech. He was frank and earnest. He was altogether kooky. He was a middle American. Just a cornfield farm boy from Iowa who treated people like people, and people liked him for it. He impressed enough to make the cabinet, impressed enough to make next in line. He proved his worth on the campaign trail, connecting with those Americans Washington rarely acknowledges, the ones the privileged silver spoon of Roosevelt couldn't feed. That's what scared them. All of them. Wallace stayed in Truman's administration after the 44 election, but ran against him on the Progressive Party ticket the following election. With Wallace and the Progressive Party all but stamped out in 1948, the shifting tides of anti-labor propaganda would steer American culture into eventual Reaganism. This was the turning point. Democrats sold out, didn't stand their ground, gave in to greed. Republicans who hadn't seen the White House in over a decade were just starting to try and rebuild power outside of Congress and the states. The states. You remember that. It'll come up later. As mentioned, the big switch happened in the mid-1950s and early 1960s as Ronald Reagan left the Democratic Party left Ronald Reagan when they decided to push the Civil Rights Act through. And Ronald Reagan, along with many other white supremacists and white superiorists in America, fled the Democrats to either run to the welcoming open arms of Dixiecrats or Republicans, respectively. This was around the time the mafia was infiltrating unions and the corporate greed sentiment that unions were corrupt and bad and government was interfering in their jobs with all these regulations, the gaslighting of America against our best interests, the brainwashing of America to just put our trust in our bosses to take care of us. And don't let the big bad evil government dictate your wages and worth. The shifting gears of conservatism in America rested on Nixon's rise and Reagan's shift right, but Barry Goldwater was a major player as well. While his eventual defeat at the hands of Lyndon Johnson in 1964 would serve as the final nail in the coffin for legitimate American conservatism's devolution into fascism, Goldwater's policies were more reflective of the tension of the conservative base. Goldwater's fiscal conservatism was a bit much for many Republicans, but again, these views are from the perspective of post-New Deal America and the sour grapes that Republicans really weren't the popular kids in town anymore and hadn't been for some time. Some in the party saw the Republicans shifting to the middle as conceding to the left and losing power, submitting. Their only play was to skew farther right if they wanted to win. To do that, they'd have to cheat while the ref wasn't looking. For conservatives' core values, winning is among the top. Goldwater's reputation of a strong, brash personality, bullheadedness, and being a loud opponent of his own party got him labeled as an extremist by most. That's important because this is where the party really began its shift. It's when Reagan was influenced by propaganda. It's when the big switch started. Nelson Rockefeller of 30 Rock fame was the more moderate Republican in the primary of '64. Just for perspective on what a moderate Republican means. He was the candidate the party pushed because they feared Goldwater would run off middle-of-the-road American conservatives with his extremist bully rhetoric. Goldwater was on that Nixonian anti-communism propaganda train preaching too much government, too much spending, too much power. Republicans were concerned that his temperament and bullheadedness would lead to a nuclear war, something nobody wanted. Rockefeller was out in the open privileged class that didn't play well with blue-collar people who were mad about communism, mad about big government. It was a close primary, but Goldwater took it when he swept the South. Let's look at the elephant in the room then. Civil rights. To say Barry Goldwater was a white supremacist isn't accurate. He was a white superiorist at least. Most of America was back then. But Goldwater fought for one of his assistants to have access to the Senate cafeteria, leading to its desegregation, according to Lee Edwards' 1995 book on Goldwater. Goldwater supported the 57 and 60 Civil Rights Acts, though he missed voting on the latter. When the 1964 Act was passing through Congress, Goldwater supported it in committee, but wouldn't vote for it on final passing, becoming only one of 6 Republicans in Congress to oppose it. Goldwater opposed it because he didn't like Titles 2 and 7, which dealt with public accommodations and equal employment opportunity. He felt that was too much government meddling in business in the free market. The market should dictate what is fair, and the government should just stay out of it. Shouldn't interfere in capitalism, except to bail us out when it fails, apparently. States' rights. Federalists versus anti-federalists. Big government versus small government. Here we are again. So why was Senator Barry Goldwater so vocally critical of Eisenhower, his own party's president, enough to be labeled an extremist? Remember how New Deal Democrat Ronald Reagan cheered on Truman, and then because America wasn't all awash in two-party political cultism as bad as we are today, Reagan liked Ike, like a lot of America did, but urged the moderate, somewhat progressive Republican Eisenhower to run as a Democrat. Eisenhower was a conservative, but a moderate to progressive kind of conservative for Republicans. Like a John McCain. He was problematic with his anti-communism, anti-labor stances, as well as the Lavender Scare. But when it came to policy, when he was working with both sides, he was considered a maverick, reaching across the aisle. He wasn't as popular at the time as history paints the picture, but his bipartisan approach should be noted if for nothing more than the last time it willingly happened for Republicans. Conservatives like Barry Goldwater couldn't stand that. They didn't want Democrats to win anything. If conservatives were in power, then kick the minority when they're down so they never rise to power again. They wanted a conservative America and began to see that as the only way to preserve their values, their power, their way of life, their culture, and their majority. Goldwater conservatives opposed Eisenhower because Ike was working with Democrats in Congress on setting legislation and policy. He was giving the minority voices an ear. The grand old party was at a crossroads. Steer the party back to sensible conservative values, or exploit the fears and ignorance of the masses through extremism. Goldwater lost. Conservatives didn't accept the loss as a loss, but as a slight hurdle. If America didn't want Goldwater, Republicans heard him loud and clear, right? Clearly, America felt like Goldwater wasn't extreme enough. The seeds of obstructionism were planted, but with Democrats holding congressional majorities for most of Ike's run, the Goldwater base's frustration with compromising would swell into an obsessive fervor that would shift the Republican Party and American conservatives even further right, laying the path leading us to today. Coming up, from Goldwater to coming off the gold standard, the 60s and 70s were where the seeds of division that we see today were planted. They were nurtured and fed with all the rich, nourishing fertilizer of Reagan, then sprouted, grew into the tall, immovable redwoods of prideful ignorance, Dunning-Kruger conspiracy theories, and selling souls to cultism. American politics during this time devolved to cash me outside and match that energy. The obstructionism over decades caused a stalemate of progress, greed to foster into a cancerous wealth gap, eating away at the interior organs of our society. How the American working class fell for it and then fought for it, surrendering our rights, voting against our better interests election after election, is a tragic tale of not knowing any better and not caring enough to fight back. In Part B of the Devolution of the Southern Democrat, I'm putting it all together to showcase the utter shit show that comes with a two-party system filled with 5 or 6 different ideologies at least. I'm going to explain just how the big switch not only drew the hard line in the political sand of racism. The big switch was when the Democratic Party began to really filter the white supremacists out of their party once and for all. I'm explaining where they landed, why they landed there, and why they were allowed to grow in numbers, having their toxic Confederate ideals validated and normalized. I'm explaining just how the Southern Democrat devolved into the fascist alt-right MAGA cult, as I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. My book, Overthinking Everything About You, is available right now on Amazon. You can link to it through my website, joshbrandonmedia.com. Check out some of my other videos on YouTube. You'll find them all organized in these nice playlists for you. My original music, my TikToks, all of Overthinking Everything, clips of my voiceover and acting career. It's all organized for your convenience. Check out my merch store, get your trigger tees in the Sir Talks a Lot, Swags a Lot store on my website, and more products are always coming soon. Follow me on TikTok and everywhere you can find me online. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Do all the things I need you to do to help me grow and get my message out. If you like this series, of course, consider a donation to Cash App, and don't forget to sign up for my email list. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.